All right. Thank you so much to Dina Brulles for joining us today. Dina is the Gifted Education Director at Paradise Valley Unified School District and the Gifted Program Coordinator at ASU. Dina serves as Governance Secretary for the NAGC's Board of Directors, and she co-authored the books, many of them, A Teacher's Guide to Flexible Grouping and Collaborative Learning, Designing Gifted Education Programs, Differentiated Lessons for All Learners, the Cluster Grouping Handbook, Teaching Gifted Kids in Today's Classrooms, Helping All Gifted Children Learn, and the Naglieri Ability Test Verbal. So, Dr. Brulles, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you for this wonderful presentation on building inclusive gifted programs to enfranchise and empower all gifted learners. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. And I've been so impressed with this series that CAGT puts on. I've had a pleasure of going and viewing some of the past ones. And so I think this follows suit with a lot of what you've been hearing thus far. I'm going to be talking about building inclusive gifted programs, but also leading up to that. How do we even frame our minds around inclusive programs? So before I began the presentation, she just mentioned some of the books that I've written. The one thing that all of these books have in common is they all have inclusivity as the basis. So I'll talk to you about a variety of different gifted programs and how to make those inclusive. But my work has all centered around inclusivity, in franchising diversity into our gifted programs, and making our gifted programs authentic to serve the students that we have. So my whole message today is just about that in particular. I'm going to move this so you can see. Today's topics that we're going to talk about first are going to set the stage for how we build inclusive programs and why we even need to, by talking about our gifted learners and inclusive identification practices, because we really can't create inclusive programs if we don't have inclusive identification practices. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of grouping in the schools and the classrooms, and how that fits into their different gifted programs. One really important thing to me is I'm a gifted coordinator. So building sustainable gifted services is where we really need to emphasize a lot of our focuses when we're talking about building gifted programming. I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits of developing a continuum of services, and some advocacy advice for parents and for teachers. Many of you are parents and teachers here, and a lot of times you might feel like developing the gifted program is not in your hands. So I'm going to try to give you some language and some thoughts and some ideas on how to send that message to when you're working with school administrators, governing boards, parent groups, classroom teachers or principals. I think that a lot of it is how we frame our message, and that's what helps us make some of this more effective and sustainable. So I'm going to talk about a few students, and you'll see why I think building inclusive programs is so critical. This is Ava. Ava's a third grade ELL student, a recent immigrant from Mexico. And in my district, our language acquisition testers test those students that come in that speak another language. And so I work with those language acquisition testers to help them recognize signs of giftedness in the students that they're testing, the ELL students they're testing for language acquisition, because they see things that others do not. They might see things that, because they might be familiar with the culture, with the language, they see a lot of these kids, ELL kids, coming into their schools. So they see the differences when they have a child who has very high ability. But this is the case with Ava. They did recognize that, and they said, you think you need to come and have this child tested. We need to look at her. So we tested her. She didn't speak English. She got a 95% on the Naglieri nonverbal ability test. And her ELL teacher was really kind of shocked at how quickly she acquired English during that first year while she was in school. And here, this is Jason. Jason, I think we all know a lot of Jasons. He is a twice exceptional gifted student, and he was identified as gifted through special ed testing when he was in kinder. And actually, the same thing in the story reference I just made to language acquisition testers, I work very closely with our special ed department, with our school psychologists, and because they are seeing kids, they're getting kids nominated to them for learning differences. And a lot of times, it's more often than you would think. Some of these kids do show very high signs of ability within the gifted testing. So I want those people to know what to look for as well. Well, Jason had some challenges in the classroom and some erroneous perceptions by the teachers because they really looked at the behaviors. They weren't seeing how the child was thinking and processing information. So they were very surprised when the special ed department came back and said, oh, he has 140 IQ. He had a couple other things going on as well. He was dyslexic, dysgraphic, he was ADD. He had a really hard time organizing anything, his day, his schoolwork, his projects, but he was also incredibly perceptive and loved to learn. And here is Shira. Shira is highly gifted and radically accelerated. She came from India into my school district, and she was reading at 3 years old. And in kindergarten, when she came in, she was able to comprehend chapter books in English, even though they spoke a different language at home. So she was highly gifted, and her math acuity was also exceptional. When we tested her the spring of the kinder year, she was 99 across all the batteries in the CAGT. So you might look at these 3 children and think, they are so different from each other. How in the world is any gifted program going to serve them? Well, in my school district where I'm the coordinator, we're fortunate that we have a continuum of services because we have 30 elementary schools. And when you have a fairly large district, you have more ability to create some of those. So I'll tell you how I serve them in my district, but then I'm also going to share with you methods for if you have these kids and you have a small school with maybe two classes in each grade level, what are different ways that we could approach instruction for them? And if you're a parent of one of these children, you might think about ways that you can use this type of language to advocate for different methodologies, instructional practices, curriculum within that classroom if there's not a standalone gifted program that's going to be sufficient for all of these students. But as you can imagine, they all require very different approaches toward their learning. If they're in the same program with the same instruction, it's highly unlikely that their learning needs would be met. So their learning needs to be tailored for these kids. And this is how I serve them. Once again, I have a larger district. I'm going to break this down on if you have a smaller situation. But in my school district, we have a gifted cluster classroom at every single grade level. And then in the higher grades, they are served in content replacement for honors, reading, and math with a gifted specialist. And I'll go through more of this a little bit later, but that's how she was served. Ava was served. She was in a cluster classroom. Now, you remember, she didn't speak English fluently. Even after her first year, she was brought in and learned it along, but we still placed her in a gifted cluster classroom. And then we still included her in the honors classes later on in which she got into grades 3rd through 6th. She was more fluent at that time. Now, Jason, he also participated in these 2 programs, the cluster placement and an honors reading. But we also have a twice exceptional program, and where he started off, and this is for uniquely gifted children. It's called the Uniquely Gifted program, and you can look it up on my gift district website, Paradise Valley School District. But Jason was within that program for a couple of years, and then he went ahead and moved into the other gifted programs. I know it's very rare to have a 2E program, but it's simple enough to train a teacher in a cluster classroom about the different ways these kids think, process information, learn, some of the modifications to curriculum and some of the interventions that are really effective with those students. So we can teach these teachers in whatever setting. And then there's Shira. Shira was the one that was radically accelerated academically. And in my district, we have a self-contained gifted program for highly gifted students who are radically accelerated. It's a very small program. Well, actually, it's a larger program, but it's a small percentage of our students. So we have this located at 5 different sites, but the students have to be pretty much identified across the board, verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal, and then they have to be 2 grade levels accelerated content. Why am I sharing this with you? Because these kids, this child who is highly gifted and radically accelerated probably needs something different than does Ava or Jason. They need to be accelerated. They need to be grouped with other kids like them so that the teacher is able to make some of those interventions common in practice on a daily basis. I'm going to go a lot more into programming after a while, but I wanted to give you these 3 profiles because I wanted to share with you, they're very different, right? But they all have high ability. And we just have to figure out how to identify. It's pretty easy to identify that for Shira, but for Jason and Ava, sometimes their challenges will shine brighter than some of their strengths at the very beginning before we are able to bring those out. So really, no matter what type of program you have, effectiveness of any gifted program really relies on teacher training and getting information to teachers on an ongoing basis. So in my district, I have all of our teachers, our cluster teachers work together in PLCs, professional learning communities. Our gifted teachers, gifted specialists, self-contained, whoever, we're going to talk about grouping gifted students, but we also want to group our teachers together so that we can, for professional learning opportunities, so that we can make sure that we're getting them what they need. So I just mentioned high ability, and what is really, when we're looking at our gifted testing, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for kids that have higher ability than average. And what does that mean? It means that they make relationships between ideas and things and information in school, in their learning, in every part of their lives. They're always making connections, regardless if they're 2E, regardless if they don't speak English, regardless if they're highly gifted or garden variety gifted. This is what high ability means. They also learn very, very quickly, and they have excellent memories, especially for things that you would rather them not. I remember probably sometimes. They have ability to learn advanced content much more quickly than their peers. And that is why we need to group them together. So I like to think about giftedness as G, general ability. So I've been talking about 3 areas that we typically identify: verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal. But those are different constructs. It's a construct of the test item that makes it verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal. They all are avenues to measure general ability. And that is what allows us to solve the different kinds of problems: reasoning, memory, sequencing, patterning, making connections, having insights and analyzing information, drawing inferences, and thinking with complexity. That's what general ability allows our students to do that at exceptional rates beyond others. So one of the things that I know is kind of controversial in our field, but I like to separate ability with knowledge. If you're really smart, you have high general ability. We don't want to confound that by knowledge, because there's a lot of really smart kids who are not knowledgeable. They have the ability, that have the potential, like, for example, Ava, who wasn't speaking English. She's not going to do well on a verbal test with information that's asking her what she learned in school. Jason might have a hard time with that as well because of some of his exceptionalities. But if we focus on what makes these kids gifted, which is that general ability, then we are able to help them gain that knowledge and achieve in schools, which is our ultimate goal. But first we have to accept them for who they are and recognize that they are smart. So once again, Verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal, those are different measures for general intelligence. The type of the test describes the construct of the test item, not the type of thinking, not the type of learning. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, my child is identified in verbal and she's an avid reader, she's very articulate, she loves to talk, blah, blah, blah. Yes, those kids are going, if they're identified on that type of a test, they are going to be more advanced in those areas, but it does not mean that she's not gifted in math or advanced in science or other areas. Same thing with quantitative. So let me tell you a little story. When I went into my current district, this was 16 years ago, we had a content replacement for verbal. Those kids identified on a verbal test were placed in honors reading. Those kids that were identified on a quantitative battery or test were placed in honors math. So I said, what about the kids who are identified on a nonverbal test or battery? They said, oh, they come into Friday, and the last 20 minutes of our math class on Fridays. I said, well, why do they do that? And they said, because they're really good at logic puzzles, so we do logic puzzles with them. And I said, well, where's the logic in that? You're going to take a really smart child and give them more of what they're already good at without applying that high ability to the core content? And they said, oh, wait, we can't bring them into the honors math or reading classes because they don't do as well. And I said, well, of course they don't do as well because you're not treating them as if they're gifted. You're treating them as if they're nonverbal. And first of all, there's no such thing as a nonverbal individual, human being. We all are verbal. We think with language. We might be thinking with a different language. I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. But so don't let the area of identification close you down if you're a parent thinking, well, my child can't be in that type of a program because they're nonverbally identified or quantitative. It's the construct of the test item that tells you if it's verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal. These kids are really, really smart. So here's the distinction that I wanted to make with you. Clarification of terms. Gifted means really smart, and talented means very accomplished. So when we are identifying kids to test in the school, a lot of times teachers are going to be looking for those kids who are getting straight A's. Kids are getting their homework, turning it in and doing well on it. I would rather find kids who are thinking with complexity, who ask a lot of questions, who can go in depth into a certain content area and is super excited about learning about that area. The problem is, if we're looking at these tests that have a lot of language in them, we're going to miss these kids, like some of the kids that I've been describing. And also, if we require that they respond orally, once again, we're going to miss these kids. So using a test of ability that demands knowledge is not reasonable for these kids. I'm going to give you a different way to look at it in a minute. So my solution is to measure the thinking, not knowledge. You might think, that's a lot harder than it sounds, and it's true. It is. It's complex, but there's new approaches that have been recently emerging where we're able to do that. We're able to not look at the child for what they know and what they've learned in school, but how they can think. Let me tell you another story. I was teaching fourth grade. I was a bilingual teacher at the time. Actually, I was a bilingual gifted cluster teacher. So I had the bilingual students, but I also had students that were clustered into my classroom. Some of them were Spanish speakers. So I got a new student. I was teaching fourth grade. And if any of you been a teacher, you get that over the announcement or you get the call and you say, Mrs. Brulles, you have a new student. So Hado walked into my class. His face, he was staring down at the ground. He wouldn't look at anybody. I gave him his seat. I spoke to him in Spanish, trying to make him comfortable. And he did not speak a word, not even to me in Spanish. He just kept looking around the room. And he was staring at the alphabet and number strip above the board, the ABC and the numbers. And the next day, after school that day, I went to his cue file to the office to see what his story was. And it turned out that this child had not had formal education. And he was in they put him in fourth grade because it was age appropriate. He hadn't been in school. They were a homeless family and came from Mexico recently. So the next day he walked in and I said, and he looks at the board and he says, Y. I'm like, That's great. Speaking of Spanish, of course, that's wonderful. You're talking to me. What is, and he said, Y, and that's all he said. So we went through the daily opening of the class, and on the board, there was an analogy that said 11 to 25 is L to blank. And he said, Y, because he was looking at the number strip and the alphabet strip, and he was making sense of it. He was finding a relationship, and he made that connection to that analogy. And remember, he'd never been in school before. He obviously knew his letters and numbers, but this child did not have that knowledge. So when we're looking at background knowledge and educationally, so when we're thinking about, when we give a child a test or a problem to solve, we have to ask ourselves, what does the student have to know to complete the task? That's dependent upon educational opportunity. In this child on the left, you say, I know this because he's learned it in school. Great. And another child, perhaps like Hiro, says, how does the child have to think to complete the task? And that's dependent on how that child thinks. He thinks, I need to see relationships. Both of these kids are smart. One of them's accomplished, and one of them is not yet accomplished. Unfortunately, a lot of our tests in school that measure giftedness, ability, do contain a lot of knowledge, which is why we have a hard time identifying some of these students. So one of the things I'm going to talk about very, very briefly is, and if you were on one of these sessions at CAGT a few months ago, you might have seen somebody mention this, go into depth on this. I'm not going to go into depth on it. I'm just going to bring it to your awareness, because this is how we are going to create inclusive programs, by having inclusive identification. And some of this new test that I'm using now in my district, I actually was involved in the construction of it. And it's measuring general ability equitably using the Naglieri general ability tests, verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal. So when we talk about tests that measure general ability, such as these tests, I'm going to talk about real briefly, but I'm going to show you the difference on why these tests are able to identify those students with some more diversity. The tests have different content, but they all rely on what I just mentioned, G, general ability. They all require understanding relationships among ideas. One of the awesome things about these tests is that the initial research results were done on about, I think, 9,000 students. In the verbal test, the one that I wrote, we saw that there's no differences in gender, no differences between white, Black, and Hispanic, and no differences between the parental education level, which is huge. This right here is I think it's one of the biggest obstacles of us being equitable identification. The nonverbal and the quantitative had the exact same results. So you might be thinking, wait a minute, we're testing there's a test that has 0 difference between white, Black, and Hispanic, negligible, like 0.01, that type of a thing. And the parental level. So those tests exist. If you're interested at the end, I'll give you some samples of those test items, but the reason that they work is because they contain no language. The verbal items were written with verbal concepts, conceptual understanding of language acquisition, of language development, of language cognition, how we acquire language, basically. And it's through pictures, and the students have to find relationships. I saved a few samples at the end in case anyone's interested. The nonverbal and the quantitative, the same thing. There's no calculations, there's no word problems in the quantitative. And so we're able to really get down to the essence of how these kids think, which makes them demonstrate their high ability. And so, okay, now let's move into the second part of this, grouping students. Why is grouping students so important? It allows the students to work with peers on different projects and the purpose of the lessons. This is a graph that shows you exactly why we need to group our gifted students. This is developed by Scott Peters, Michael Matthews, Matt Makel, and Jonathan Plucker. And I believe they presented on this at NAGC. But several years ago, but this is a hypothetical fourth grade classroom. And it's a reading, they based this on reading. Now, the reason they did this study, from what I understand, was that at a conference, somebody was asking them, what's the grade level span of students, achievement level span of students in a certain classroom or grade level? So they thought, we don't have that data. So they looked at several 100,000 students' achievement data, and they looked at some of the top 5, I believe, achievement tests throughout the country. And they calculated that this is the range. There's approximately an 8 grade level range of achievement within any given classroom. So if your child is way up here in this 4th grade reading at this level, at the 12th grade level, the 9th grade level, or even the 7th grade level, what's the likelihood that they're going to have instruction directed to them when there's also kids working at a 1st and 2nd grade level, right? This is why our gifted students get so frustrated. We know that. But in this hypothetical classroom, if the teacher is teaching to the 4th grade, because it is a 4th grade classroom, she's reaching about 28% of her students. Now, she could go down a little bit and reach some of those kids working at a 3rd grade level. She could go up a little bit and reach some of those kids at a 5th grade level, maybe even touch upon somebody at a 6th grade level. But it's really, really hard. I don't care what amazing teacher you are or your kids have, it's nearly impossible. And I know this because I've been a teacher for a very long time, and I've taught a lot of gifted students, and I've taught a lot of bilingual students. And I know that that's impossible. So it's really important that it's possible to do it effectively. Some people might say, I can do it. Sure. Some superstar teachers might think they can do it most of the time, but all of the time, that's a tough one. So sometimes people say, well, we don't believe in grouping because grouping is elitist, or grouping is tracking, or grouping is one thing or the other. It's good for smart kids, it's not good for the little kids. None of the research bears that out if you use what I like to say, flexible grouping. And a lot of times, face it, when we have a gifted program, we're grouping. That's the grouping, that we're putting the gifted students together. But some of you might be out there and say, my school is small, we don't have a gifted program, but you can still group. And if you're a parent of gifted students and you're trying to find ways to help the schools understand that your child needs something different, there's so many different ways of grouping. At the very beginning, I mentioned that one of the books I read was A Teacher's Guide to Flexible Grouping and Collaborative Learning. This book is all about all of these different ways to group and strategies to use within those groups. So if you're a parent who is trying to get your school to group your children differently, you might want to take a look at that. And if you're a teacher who's got a range of students and you're saying, I'm not able to get to all of them the way I should be, I always also recommend grouping, looking at that. So and this all comes from that flex grouping book, but here's a couple flexible grouping frameworks that really foster inclusivity. And it doesn't matter if you have a mega gifted program like I do, or if you have zero gifted program. These are different ways of grouping your students, the children together based on what they need. Isn't that what we are in education for? To make sure we're giving students instruction at the level that they need? There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes people say, oh, with grouping, you can't group because then these kids are going to feel left out. They're not going to do that if you create flexible grouping frameworks. And let me just walk you through a couple of these. Ability-based, that's like I was just saying, gifted programs are mainly ability-based groupings. A lot of those are stagnant, but new kids come in. But there's also ways of grouping within a gifted class, if that's what you have, or within a gifted program, if that's what you have. Or if you were just in a gen ed class and you've got your children in that class and there's no gifted program, we also as teachers can group based on interests, because whether you're a parent or a teacher of gifted students, you know that gifted students have a lot of awesome interests that they love to pursue and go into depth into those. And they get super excited about developing those interests and pursuing those interests. And if the teacher is not teaching something that's interesting to them, they might tune out, right? But if you have a group of students who all have a similar interest or get excited about a certain thing, group those together and then build those standards into what they are learning to their topics. And then you get kids who are really super excited about learning along with like-minded peers. Performance-based grouping, that could be based on a pretest. And we know as parents and teachers that we need our kids to be able to demonstrate what they know before we try to tell them what they're going to learn, because nobody should sit through a lesson as something that they have already mastered that content for. So if you're a parent, you might want to advocate for your teacher to say, oh, I see you're going to be talking about the solar system. You know, my child really interested in this and would love to do a project with other kids who are interested in that at their level. Performance-based then would be, if you're doing a pre-assessment, we're going to say you're going to be teaching two-digit or two-digit multiplication and your child's already doing division at that level or with decimals, ask for the pretest so that they can demonstrate that and test out, and then they can work with other kids who've tested out and they can go into more depth. So for example, say in a classroom, I'm teaching two-digit or two-digit multiplication. I'm going to give some direct instruction for 5 or 8 minutes. And then I'm going to put the end of the unit, end of the chapter test on the board. And I'm going to say, project that and say, who thinks they know this? And if you want to take the test right now, and if you get a 90% or higher, then you don't have to do the homework for this week. I'll give you some different work. Well, kids are kids. They hear, I won't have to do the homework with them. I'll try it. Say out of those class, there's 8 kids that try that. And out of those 8 kids, 5 of them were identified as gifted. This is a cluster class. And 3 of them were not. Well, out of those 8 kids that tried that pretest, 4 of them, 4, mastered it above 90%. 3 of the kids were gifted, 1 was not. Those 4 kids are going to work in a small group, and the teacher will design something different along those same lines, not just jump up to the next grade level, but say they might be creating word problems with two-digit multiplication for a game for the other students to play, an interactive poster board where they're looking at this in complexity. They might add decimals, whatever the teacher decides, but they could in this small group. So you might be thinking, so there are 5 gifted kids and 4 of them tested out. What about that one that didn't? As a teacher, I'm going to get a call and say from the parent and say, wait a minute, my son told me that all the other gifted kids got to work on this really cool project and he didn't. Why? Let me show you the pretest. He did really well in certain areas, but here's an area that really needs some more practice at. So we're going to focus on this area. Once he gets this, we're going to move him right into the enrichment group or the extension group or whatever she's calling it. And then he can work with those other students. So, but you also notice that there was an average, not a non-gifted, a gen ed kid who also had that understanding. So this is just an example of how we can use performance-based understanding in order to create our flexible learning groups and interest and ability as well. Same thing with readiness, preference, or objective. And the preference, I like to highlight this one because I did it a lot when I was a cluster teacher, where I would give students, okay, we're going to be looking at the regions of the United States, and we're going to do a project. And here's 4 different projects you can do. You can do an interactive poster, you could create a video, you can do a 5-paragraph essay, or you can create a presentation. Well, I have 4 gifted kids in my classroom. Each one of those 4 chose a different project because that was how that was getting them excited about learning. And they worked in that project with other kids who are not identified as gifted, but were equally excited about creating that presentation or creating that interactive poster or that game. So there's lots of ways that we can informally and flexibly group our students in order to draw kids in and get them excited about their learning. And notice there might be an ELL student or a twice exceptional student who is really super excited about one thing, but doesn't have some of the language. That's okay. If they're interested in it and they are excited about learning, that language will come along. But once again, we just need to engage them into the learning. So as a gifted coordinator, I hear this a lot. I talk to people all around the country a lot about gifted. This is one of my favorite cartoons is, oh, we had a great program last year, but she moved. So some of you probably experienced this before. Sometimes if we don't create sustainable gifted programs that are enmeshed into everything that's going on in the school or the district, it's dependent on one person that's leading it. That person moves on, and the next person that comes in has a different idea, or maybe they don't replace that person. Or say you have a principal who really supports gifted, and you had some of this really cool stuff going. They were cluster grouping, they were flexible grouping, they were doing some project-based learning. And then that principal moves on. Next principal comes in and says, all kids are gifted. We're not going to have a gifted program because that's elitist. We're just not going to have gifted. So all of that effort that the first principal made, or that gifted teacher or whoever was designing some of that curriculum and instruction for our gifted learners has moved on. So then the school starts again. So what I like to do is, and it's not easy and it doesn't happen overnight, but it does work really, really well. And that is, move my little screen around there. To create a successful gifted students, first we have to identify the gifted students with high potential, right? Just like I mentioned at the very beginning with Jason, Ava, and Shira, they all had high potential, but they all look very different. So first we identify them with high potential, and then we develop our services in response to those students' needs. And then we make sure that we are figuring out what training to provide to the teachers, what curriculum we need to get access to based on the needs of those students. So when we're building sustainable services, we have to remember, like I was just mentioning, people change jobs, but systems stay in place longer if you can get that built into what your school is already doing. So I think it's super important that we embed gifted services into our school structures, into our initiatives, that we provide opportunities for our administrators to collaborate. A little while ago, I told you how I work really closely with language acquisition department. I work really closely with our special ed department. I work closely with our curriculum department because they need to know that gifted cluster teachers need different levels of textbooks or curriculum or whatever access in their classroom because they have different levels. Remember that chart from Scott and Jonathan. I also work very closely with the fine arts department and those teachers. And I try to provide PD for them every so often so that they are aware of some of the strengths, abilities that some of these kids have, especially those who are of diversity who might not be showing it through academics in the classroom. So the teacher might be missing some of those strengths because she doesn't have familiarity with that student's culture or with traits of sectionality or with things like that. So I will meet with the art, music, PE, band teachers and say, look at these and give them pictures of what giftedness looks like in their areas. And then they can see some of those and then they can, so sometimes I'll have art teachers nominate kids for testing or a music teacher. And then the classroom teacher gets really surprised when they get identified and they say, well, I never saw that attention to, perspective or detail or this, or the ability to read and understand music like that, because it's a very abstract type of way of learning for some students and teachers. So in order to really build inclusive programs, we have to not only look at equitable identification and flexible grouping practices, but we need to make school administrators, principals, other folks in leadership roles aware that giftedness looks different in different kids, and therefore our services need to look different. I think I pretty much talked to that part. So when we're developing quality district-wide gifted programming, in my district, I have a parent support group, gifted parent group who's phenomenal. I meet with them let me move this, once a month. And they work with me to create different parent opportunities to, since COVID, we've been doing these virtual. I'm doing one tomorrow night, actually, Thursday night. But we do about 8 a year, and it's just by topics that parents bring to us that we know that are really, really important because the parents are seeing it. A lot of it's around social emotional, maybe perfectionism, anxiety, inclusivity, things like that, acceleration. But if you're a parent and you're working with your school, some of that awareness that you might have with the sort of the need that parents have for information, guess what? The teachers need that information as well. So for me, what I'll do is I'll do it when these folks come in and speak to my parents. I do an after school online now workshop for the teachers to talk about the same type of thing that they're going to talk about with the parents, but when the parents, it's going to be more of a parenting. So I strongly advocate for having informal or formal parent groups, just so that you can share ideas amongst yourself and find positive, proactive ways to work with school administrators and teachers to bring some of that attention to the way. The worst thing you can do is demand that something changes. I always say, working against Tatwadi takes time. Tatwadi is, that's the way we've always done it. And when I went into my current district and I asked about, what are you doing about these kids identified on a nonverbal assessment? Oh, and they told me, oh, they go into 20 minutes at the end of the week. And then they, get to be gifted for 20 minutes. And I said, well, I think we're going to need to change that. We need to bring them into the program. And I actually had somebody shake their finger at me and say, but that's the way we've always done it for 28 years. You're not going to come and change it right now. But I said, okay, backed off a little bit. And I said, I need to share information. I need to share information with the teachers, with the parents, with the administrators, with different, and I just started very informally having these workshops, inviting myself into different meetings to ask for 10 or 15 minutes at the beginning. And it really paid off dividends, I should say. Okay, let's move forward. So what I like, and when we're talking about gifted program models, this is what I like to call the gifted programming dilemma, the chicken or the egg, what comes first? And the reason I frame it this way is because I've been doing this a very long time, working with districts all over the country. I'm on the NAGC board now as government secretary, but before I was a school district rep. So I got the opportunity to work with schools throughout the country. And I did a lot of work actually with Colorado, because you have a lot of strong emphasis on gifted, much more than a lot of the states. But one of the things that I found across states that a lot of people try to do is do exactly what I told you I walked into. This is our gifted program, and now we're going to look for kids that will do well in the program. So what I say is, first of all, identify high ability, identify that potential, and then decide how you're going to fix or modify those gifted programs in order to adequately, appropriately, and sufficiently and effectively work with those gifted students who are identified in your district or your school. And I'm going to tell you, it looks different from school to school to school. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, of how we use local norms and building norms in order to create inclusive models for serving our giftedness. But there's basically 4 really common, prevalent methods for serving our gifted students: cluster grouping, honors classes, enrichment, and self-contained classrooms. And I know I want to save some time for questions, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. But cluster grouping, in my eyes, is absolutely the most inclusive way, because you are bringing in all the kids with high ability. I don't care if they're smart and at high achieving. I don't care if they have an IEP for special ed. I don't care if they're ELL. If they have high ability, we're going to bring them in, and we're going to allow them opportunities to work together in different ways. And through your honors classes, what you're going to do is, a lot of times what we see is that we see in reading and math that have to get in because of their ability and their achievement in that. So that is going to be a lot harder to be more inclusive with that, unless you also build opportunities for your teachers to know how to differentiate that instruction in order to scaffold it so some of those kids who are not yet highly achieving are able to access some of that content. But at the same time, remember, they still think that way. They still think with advanced learners who need some opportunities for enrichment, opportunities for acceleration, but some of those, if we bring them in and treat them as if they are gifted, they're going to develop that achievement, increase those achievement levels a lot higher than if we ignored them and brought them in for the last 20 minutes on Friday. Enrichment classes are very inclusive if they're based on, structured on projects that the kids really enjoy doing. So the one thing I have a problem with in enrichment classes is when they're bused to a different location or they're after school. I want to build these enrichment into the regular school day, into all the content area, into everything that they are already doing. And then the self-contained programs tend to be the most exclusive, the least inclusive, if they're like mine, and mine is we're highly gifted and highly accelerated. So you might think, why am I even telling you about this? Because I really do think that some highly gifted kids need more than the first three. Some of them just need advancement. And sometimes people say, oh, we can grade skip. I said, yeah, my way of seeing grade skipping is depriving a child of a year of their childhood. If you can just group those kids together and then bring the challenging curriculum to them, then we don't need to grade skip, right? And that's kind of what we do in our self-contained. They're learning 2 through grade levels ahead of time, but they're all grouped together and they're able to do that. But if you don't have a self-contained and you have evidence that they have mastered all of that content, ask for those pre-tests, ask for the pre-assessment, even at a quarterly or whatever, so that they can accelerate. I've talked about multiple measures and looking at giftedness based on high potential and ability as opposed to what they know. But also we need to think, and I also try to introduce multiple pathways. And we know that the kids are going to need different things. So this is an overview of, and I won't go into depth with it, but of our gifted programs in my school district. We have a gifted preschool, gifted kindergarten, and they all have different criteria for entrance. And we also use nonverbal assessments so that we can have diversity in these programs. Our self-contained content replacement, cluster grouping, I've talked a little bit about these because these are elementary, but then we have multiple different programs for our middle school students because that's when they start really honing in on what's going to drive them through their high school years to get them ready for that. If you are interested in talking to me about help different ways to help schools develop some gifted programs, feel free to contact me. They're gonna be putting my email in a little bit chat, but also in this presentation, I've included my gifted website so you can see some of the ways that I approach some of these things. And how do we know it's working? I gauge success by having the ability to meet all the needs of all gifted and talented students, not just the talented ones, but the ones with high potential. I gauge success by documenting the students' academic growth. And if we have gifted students who are not developing achievement the way they should be or not advancing achievement, let's look at the type of instruction we're providing them. Maybe we're not including them with the other smart kids that they need that opportunity to work with. And another way I gauge success is by looking at the demographics of our gifted students and of our population. And once I track this, I track it by gender, by grade level, by ethnicity, and I want to make sure that we're seeing growth in all of those different ways. And these are just a couple different ways that another way that I measure and record growth and gifted is by recording some of the paying attention to the professional development I provide to my teachers, and doing something with this data. It's one thing to collect it, but you need to share it. You need to share it with principals and school administrators. If you have some of this data and you're hiding it because you're embarrassed about it, or you're thinking you're not doing a great enough job, nobody is. Everybody needs work on. I do. Everybody does. So what I say is put this out there, and then it's going to draw attention to the district or the school to say, hey, wait a second. We're doing a really good job with those gifted kids, but we're not doing a good job with these other kids. And those are the kids that concern me the most, the ones that we are missing. And we're missing a lot in our schools. Okay, so communicate and collaborate to create opportunities for growth to evolve. I'm good. I really quickly wanted to share you a slide because the test I was sharing you. This is how we identify the verbal ability on a verbal test that has no language, where the students have to find their relationships between the different objects and what are the outliers. And to do this and non-verbally, we do it with matrices. And to do it quantitatively, there's different ways that we can measure that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing right now and go right up to the top here and see if we have time for some questions. I think we do, about 10 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dina. This has been a great presentation and a lot of really good information.
Can I stop sharing my screen now?
Yep, you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen. And we did put your email address in the Facebook Live chat so people can contact you that way. And we did have, I wanted to go through one of the questions that we had, and I think you talked about it a little because I'm really interested in your flexible grouping and that there are multiple ways to group flexibly. And the question was from Virginia Garcia Pivic. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she was wondering, Dina, are you saying that even gifted or 2E students should be segmented or grouped according to their skills and abilities? I'm thinking she's talking about that slide where you were talking about flexible groupings.
I think that, okay, first of all, I think that all kids with high ability need to be grouped together in one classroom at each grade level on a daily basis. And then within that classroom, some of those different frameworks for grouping students, interest-based, ability-based, readiness, performance, those are different ways that you can group all the students in your classroom. But how you're really serving your gifted students is because if you have a 2E child or a highly gifted kid or an ELL child who all think a little bit differently or have different interests, we're still respecting that. And this is what I don't think we do enough in gifted ed. I don't think we respect the individual for what they bring to the table and for their approach for learning. But if we can flexibly group the students to give them opportunities to look at information and details in a way that really motivates them and excites them, then we're going to make a lot more progress with those students, and they're going to be a lot happier in your class, and they're going to learn more.
That's fantastic. I'm excited to go back and share with my teachers kind of the breakdown of all the different types, because I think sometimes they get it stuck in their head that there's just one way. And I appreciate that it's, there's so many others.
That
all right.
flexible grouping book really goes into depth and detail and also lessons that the teachers can use to bring out some of the strengths in some of those diverse learners.
Oh, that's awesome. All right. Renee Price has a couple of questions. First, she's wondering what percentage of students in your programs are in self-contained classrooms?
A tiny percent. We have about 5,000 gifted students in my district. And I have to tell you, a lot of those come from surrounding districts, because in Arizona, you can go to whatever district you want. And so we, if there's space, and in our gifted programs, there's going to be space because we always want to bring in more smart kids, because we're excited about teaching them. But our self-contained, there's probably maybe 7 or 8%.
Okay. And then Renee has a couple of others. What's your feeling about the data that shows the benefits of grade skipping? And then I'll let you answer that, and then I'll ask you.
Sure. Grade skipping is a great strategy if you do not have a gifted program that will reach those highly accelerated learners. So in my self-contained gifted programs for highly gifted students, I have fourth graders, but tons of them who are in honors geometry. We don't put a cap on what they can learn or the level to which they can go. They're doing incredibly complex things that most high schoolers won't ever do, some of them in the self-contained elementary gifted. So I don't have a reason to grade skip them because I've got elementary kids dual enrolled in college courses while they're in my gifted program. So no, I don't need to. But if you don't have opportunity to radically accelerate, if you don't have a gifted program that's going to really reach those kids, if you don't have connections and collaborations you can make with local community resources, well, then yeah, if that's your only choice, then yeah, I agree with it if that's the only choice. But I'm just saying, I hate to see a 13-year-old go into high school or into college or something and miss all these other opportunities. That's just my perspective. Everyone has their own.
That's great. Thank you so much. And then the last one Renee had, oh, and by the way, Virginia said your response is spot on. Thank you so much. Her daughter is 2E and she has a hard time with teachers understanding that distinction you just made. My assumption was observational and yours is based on your vast experience. Thanks again. And then Renee's last question is, how do you address the maturity differences between students? Gifted students often fit so much more comfortably with older students than with the younger ones.
And that's why it's so important to group them together, because mine are grouped together every single day in no matter what program. In the gifted preschool, in the cluster classroom, there's going to be 5 or 15 of them in a classroom, or any number, whatever grade level, whatever school. So the other thing is we also in our gifted programs, we do a lot of mentoring. So like our 6th grade gifted are going to mentor our kinder and first. Our 4th grade students are going to be mentored by our high school gifted students. So I really do appreciate the importance of having that opportunity to work with some of the older peers intellectual peers, but they thrive on it. They love it. They enjoy it. But even if the conversations that I will see in a 4th grade cluster class or 6th grade self-contained class, the conversations, once you have all those gifted students together, they are with like-minded peers and they're having those adult conversations or those highly advanced conversations that no other 4th grader or 6th grader would have. So they do get those opportunities as well, and they love it. That's why it's so important to group them.
I agree. I think that's wonderful. Renee says, thank you very much. So I think we're almost out of time and I don't see any other questions on here. So I want to thank you again for sharing such important information with us today and being with us. And we will definitely have this recorded and put on our website within probably a week. And I just have appreciated the time you've taken, Dina. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I appreciate all that CAGT does to support families, teachers, and administrators. It's a very impressive organization. You guys are lucky to have this leadership in your state. So thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone on Facebook.